Hey, tonight we're not heading to grand castles or powerful kings. We're going to the forgotten edges of history, the parts that don't show up in paintings or schoolbooks. This is about the people who lived quietly in the background, medieval peasants. They didn't wear crowns or ride into battle. They faced hunger, disease, cold winters, and 100 little daily struggles. No fame, no name passed down through time, just long, tiring days and short nights. A kind of quiet strength most of us couldn't handle even for a day. If this slow, peaceful kind of history helps you relax, feel free to like the video or subscribe, only if it really brings you some calm. And if you're comfortable, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something comforting about seeing all the people out there falling asleep to the same gentle story. So, go ahead, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get comfortable. We're starting at the edge of the map. This village we're going to, it doesn't have a name. Or maybe it did once, but no one remembers it now. It sits low in a quiet valley, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. Just far enough off the path that no roads, records, or royals ever paid it any attention. Even if you had a map, you wouldn't find it. And you don't. You've never seen a real map. And it wouldn't matter if you had. Out here, the world just fades into the forest. The trees stand thick and still, like something ancient that barely puts up with people being nearby. The fields stretch out in uneven patches, green and brown, worked until you're too tired to stand, then worked some more. Far off to the north, there's supposed to be a river. You've never seen it, but people talk about it the same way they talk about saints or old legends. This is where you were born. This is where you'll die. Maybe just 60 steps between the two. The homes here lean a little, like the wind's been pushing on them too hard for too many winters. The walls are made of mud, straw, and sticks, woven together, patched again and again with whatever hasn't been ruined by the weather yet. The roofs are thatched and always sagging, dripping water in spots you just can't fix. The village smells like wet wool, smoke, and dirt. There's a bit of sour animal smell, maybe a hint of rot when it rains. But it's just how life smells here. You don't notice it anymore. The road into the village isn't really a road, just a muddy path with 2 deep grooves worn in by ox carts. They hold rainwater and mosquitoes more than they ever held travellers. No one important's come through in years, maybe ever. Most days pass quietly. If the wind's right, you might hear a distant church bell from another village. Otherwise, you tell time by the sun in the sky, the way shadows stretch across the ground, or the dull ache in your back that shows up before noon. There are maybe a dozen families here, just enough to crowd around a fire on feast days. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows each other's troubles. And we all pretend not to until it really matters. The village elder, if you'd call him that, is a man named Tom. They say he once spoke to a monk and now he tells that story like it makes him wise. No one argues. Tom's hut is still standing, his goats still alive. That's all the leadership anyone needs. Nothing here is exact, and that's just how it is. There are no written records here, no official maps, no papers saying who owns what. People just know the land, where the old elm stands, where the soil gets soft underfoot. If there's ever a disagreement, it usually ends with a few words, a sigh, maybe even a loaf of bread passed back and forth until no one feels like arguing anymore. There's no school, no pub, no inn. If a stranger shows up, the whole village talks about it for weeks. Who are they? What do they want? Are they cursed? Do they smell like the sea? Someone new is exciting and a little scary, and no one ever really leaves. Travel isn't something you plan. It's something you hear about, like legends or old stories. You've heard of places with tall stone buildings, cities where the houses stack up 2 or 3 floors high, but that feels like fairy tales stuff. You can't miss a world you've never seen. The forest is thick, the hills go on forever, and whatever roads might be out there, people say they're full of bandits and bad luck, not destinations. Even if you wanted to go, what would you do once you got there? You don't speak their way. You have no coins. You don't know their customs. You don't even know how old you are. So you stay, because there's safety in what you know, even if it's hard, even if your roof leaks, even if the same stew has been simmering for 3 days straight. There's comfort in routine. You know where the firewood is, you know who to ask when your fence falls down, you know which part of the sky tells you to bring the sheep in. You rise with the sun, you sleep when it sets, you work in between. It's not much, but it's life. And somewhere in the rhythm of it all, there's peace. A peace that doesn't ask questions, that doesn't need to understand anything beyond what you can see from the nearest hilltop. Now and then you hear whispers of a war, a king's death, a strange light in the sky that scared some village 5 days away. But it never quite feels real. By the time news reaches you, it's passed through too many mouths to carry any weight. The urgency fades between the merchant and the shepherd's cousin. Time moves differently here. Seasons don't flip like pages, they blend together. A wet spring becomes a soggy summer. A cold snap turns into a winter that eats through your boots. You don't count years, you count harvests. The dry one, the one when the rye turned black. The good one when the barley was so thick, even old Marjorie smiled for a whole week. Sometimes the steward comes. He asks questions, writes things down. You answer carefully, never say too much. He doesn't like too much. You've never met the king. You're not even sure what he does, but you know his name. You say it in your prayers, just in case it matters. Because here, on the far edge of everything, life rarely changes. And when it does, it's usually not for the better. But the fire still glows, the roof mostly holds, the cottage stays warm, and tomorrow the same sun will rise over the same hills. And for now, that's enough. You'll walk hundreds of miles in your life, but most of them will be in circles. People didn't stay close to home because they were lazy or scared or barefoot, though good boots were rare. They stayed because the world beyond the hills never really felt like theirs. And the idea of going to find it? Well, that felt about as likely as growing wings and flying away. You grew up knowing every stretch of land between your doorstep and the far edge of the field, every dip in the path, every crooked tree stump near the well. These things were as familiar to you as your own hands. You could read the muddy road like a book, the size of a boot print, how deep it sank, enough to tell who'd passed by and how fast. But beyond that, beyond the edge of what you walked daily, it all started to feel like myth. The next village might have only been 5 miles away, but it may as well have been another world. You heard stories, of course, who ran off with someone's wife, who got caught stealing a goat, who said the priest muttered in his sleep during Mass. But you'd never seen it. And odds were you never would, because traveling wasn't adventurous, it was dangerous. Not loud, exciting danger. The quiet, slow, maybe you don't come back kind. There weren't roads in the way we think of them now, just muddy paths winding through woods, fields, and miles of nothing. No signs, no maps, no inns, just bits of advice like, keep walking till you see the bent pine tree, then turn left when you pass the stone shaped like a sleeping pig. And those paths held their own dangers. First, the forest. These weren't gentle parks with dappled sunlight. Medieval forests were thick and shadowed, full of gnarled roots and noises you couldn't name. Wild boars, wolves, and worse, people who didn't want to be found. If you weren't born in the woods didn't want you there. Then there were the bandits. People with empty bellies and nothing left to lose. If you looked healthy, you looked rich. If you walked with purpose, they assumed you had something worth taking. A lone woman? She must be carrying something valuable, or someone might think she was the valuable thing. You learned early. Looking confident didn't protect you. And then there was the risk of getting lost. Not a harmless kind of lost. This wasn't a place where someone would come looking. If you took the wrong turn, that could be the end. No search parties, no rescue, just you alone in the brush, swallowed up like you'd never been. Sometimes people weren't missed until the next holy day. Someone would ask, "Where's Thomas?" And someone else would shrug. Even if you managed to survive the journey, what about everything back home? Who would tend your crops, feed your animals? What if the steward came to collect tax while you were gone? Try explaining your absence to a man with a pen and a tally sheet. And let's say you did reach another village. What then? You weren't expected, you weren't welcomed. Strangers meant risk, disease, trouble, strange ways. You spoke a bit differently, used odd words. Maybe you even held your spoon the wrong way. That was enough to make people uneasy, or worse, hospitality wasn't something you could count on. Food was too scarce to share freely, and most beds were already spoken for. The safest place you had was home, not because it was truly safe, but because it was known. You knew which corner of the roof would drip when it rained, which chickens liked to wander too close to the woods, and which neighbor might lend a tool if you didn't ask for too many favors. Beyond the village, no one owes you anything. Still, now and then, people did travel. Not peasants usually, but merchants, monks, or messengers, those with protection, purpose, or both. They'd roll through once or twice a year, carts piled high with wool or barrels of salted fish, leaving behind stories like the smoke of an old fire. They spoke of cities where buildings stood tall in stone, where shops sold spices from places you'd never heard of, and where the roads didn't turn to mud the moment it rained. It all sounded too far-fetched to be real. You listened with wide eyes, but kept your dreams small. Because even if such places existed, what would someone like you do there? You couldn't read, you had no coins. You wouldn't know how to speak or act or walk without drawing the wrong kind of attention. A city could swallow you whole, and not a single person would know or care what your name had been. So you stayed. Not because you were a coward, though fear sometimes tugged at the edge of your thoughts, but because there was barely enough to dry, a fence that needed fixing, a niece to keep an eye on, and stew bubbling on the fire that might burn if left too long. And because, if you were honest, you didn't need the world to be any bigger than it already was. The village gave you enough. There was gossip to trade, arguments to grumble about, illness to endure, and laughter that came and went like the passing sun. The bells rang in their rhythm, the seasons turned, and every day you managed to keep going was a quiet triumph. Sometimes, when the sky was clear and the woods looked almost welcoming, you wondered what lay beyond. But most days all you hoped was that the fire wouldn't go out before supper. Some people did leave, the desperate, the bold, the young with more dreams than sense. A boy might head off in search of work, adventure, or a cause to die for. Sometimes he came back limping, or with stories too big to believe. Often he didn't come back at all. When that happened, no one wept in the streets. They just nodded and said, "He went past the trees." As if that explained everything. Maybe it did. For those who stayed behind, life was narrow, but it was rooted. You weren't truly alone. You shared your days with kin, with neighbors, with the livestock, and the soil beneath your feet. There was comfort in the routine, comfort in the familiar complaints. You didn't need to chase distant wonders to know the sweetness of warm bread, or the ache of love, or the stillness of sorrow. And as the years passed, and your joints began to stiffen, and the children grew taller than the garden fence, the urge to leave faded, not in disappointment, but in peace. You hadn't seen the world, but you had lived, and somehow that was enough. Some people were born to roam. You weren't. You were meant to stay. There's no blueprint, no master plan, no carefully stacked piles of timber waiting to become something grand. Just mud, old wood, and whatever the land hasn't already taken back for itself. Your home isn't a house, not in the way others might picture one. It's more like a quiet negotiation between shelter and season, between your effort and time's slow undoing, between what you need and what the earth grudgingly lets you keep. You begin with the frame, rough-cut timbers from the nearest trees, shaped by tools older than your memory. Tools used by hands now buried under the same soil you walk. The wood twists, it leans, but so do you some days. Nothing is perfectly straight, not your walls, not your life. You weave slender branches between the beams, bending them through gaps as best you can. It's called wattle. It's not quick, it's not pretty, but it holds, mostly, like everything else. Then comes the daub, a mixture of mud, straw, manure and water. You slap it on with your hands, you press it into the spaces, you smooth it down enough to keep out the wind and tell yourself the cracks are just part of the charm. It dries unevenly, it crumbles with the sun. Sometimes whole pieces fall away and have to be patched again before the frost returns. You get used to the smell. After a while it fades into the background like the creak of the beams or the sound of the hens settling in for the night. The roof is thatch. Tightly packed layers of straw lashed to beams. Fresh, it glows golden under the sun. Almost beautiful. But then the rains come. Then the birds. Then time. It darkens, it frays. You notice the leaks first by the soft drip on your cheek in the middle of the night. Then by the buckets you place in corners you hoped would stay dry. There's no shingles. No ceiling. Only endless patchwork until your roof feels more like a memory of a roof than a roof itself. Some days the thought of sleeping under a cart seems almost reasonable. The floor is dirt, you call it packed, and mostly it is. Years of sweeping, stomping, spilling, pacing, but when it rains it softens, when it freezes it cracks. When the goats wander in for the night, you don't ask what you're stepping in, you throw down fresh straw, knowing it'll be filth again in a week. Eventually the line between floor and straw vanishes and you accept it. It's just how things are. Windows? Not really, just holes in the walls with wooden shutters that never quite close all the way. Glass is a luxury, rare, fragile, expensive, so the cold slips in, the wind, the sounds of the animals, and sometimes the animals themselves. The door hangs slightly off, shifted from the last frost. It latches with a wooden peg or a hook. Not for safety, there's little worth stealing, just to keep the chickens in and the wind out. Inside there isn't a layout so much as shared space. One room, maybe two, if someone managed to add a lean-to or loft, but mostly one room for everything. Sleeping, eating, cooking, arguing, mending, grieving, hoping. Everyone lives here. Parents, children, a cousin, a grandparent, maybe the neighbour's child whose parents are gone. There's a hearth in the centre. Stone, if you're fortunate. Clay, if you're not. No chimney, just a hole above where the smoke curls out, slowly. The air is always a little smoky, a little damp, always carrying the faint scent of stew that's been stretched too long across too many meals. Furniture is scarce. A bench, a table, maybe a stool. A chest if someone in your family married well or carved better than most. Beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers, shared, noisy, never quite soft. Blankets are wool, thick, itchy, always a little damp. Up in the rafters there's storage, garlic, onions, drying herbs, maybe a bit of smoked ham, if the pig was kind and the butcher kinder. The air changes with the seasons. In winter it smells of salt and smoke. By spring it smells like hope running thin. Sometimes it comforts, sometimes it warns. Animals are part of the home, literally. A cow might sleep in the far corner, a goat curled near the wall, chickens roosting where they shouldn't. It's not clean, but it's warm. And warmth, in the end, is what keeps you going. You learn to live with the sounds, the clucking, the soft scuffles, the sudden bleat that cuts through the night like a question no one answers. They become part of the background, just like the wind rustling through the thatch or the slow, aching groan of the walls settling into themselves. Nothing sits straight. The floor sags, the roof dips, the walls bow ever so slightly, as if the whole place inhales and exhales with the seasons. You fix what you can. The rest, you simply learn to live around. Every spring, you promise yourself you'll repair the back wall. Every autumn, it's still leaning. This isn't a house built to last. It's a house built to survive whatever weather comes next. And yet, for all its flaws, and there are many, this place is home. You know where the cold seeps in and how to wedge an old sack into the corner to keep it out. You know which beam can hold a hanging pot and which one groans under the weight of a careless footstep. You know how the light filters through the slats in the late afternoon, and where the dog always curls up when the day ends. To a stranger passing through, it might look like poverty. To you, it's evidence of effort, of salvaging, mending, making do. A roof still overhead is a small miracle. A fire still burning come dawn is a quiet triumph. A dry patch of floor is a treasure. And when night falls and you're surrounded by the steady rhythm of breath, the scent of smoke, the weight of wool and straw and silence, you feel something close to comfort. Not quite pride, but something steadier, something rooted. This space bends and leaks and shifts, but it holds, and so do you. Food, for the average medieval peasant, was never about flavor. It wasn't an experience. It wasn't colorful or varied or particularly warm. It was a daily puzzle, same pieces, same hopes, same tired repetition, day after day. Your kitchen, if you could even call it that, was just a corner near the hearth. No pantry, no neat rows of ingredients, no window lined with fragrant herbs, just a pot, a fire, and a mental tally of what hadn't gone bad yet. At the center of it all was pottage, a sort of eternal stew that lived in the pot and rarely left it. It was never fully new and never fully gone. You added to it when you could, you took from it when you must. You kept it simmering through the seasons, praying nothing uninvited began growing in it while your back was turned. What went in depended on what was available, which, more often than not, wasn't much. On a good day, there might be cabbage, barley, leeks, and a few beans. Maybe a bit of garlic or onion, if the fields had been kind. In winter, dried peas and hope. If you were lucky, a scrap of salted pork might find its way in, more likely, just a bone. Even that was precious. You could boil a bone for days, asking it to remember the taste of meat. It always tasted the same, earthy, grey, more warmth than flavour. You didn't eat pottage for pleasure. You ate it because it was what you had. A warm bowl at the end of a long day wasn't just a meal, it was a quiet affirmation that you were still here. The pot itself never truly got clean. Wiped down, scraped maybe, but never scrubbed. Like the house, it wasn't meant to shine. It was meant to endure. Each new batch of stew carried the memory of the last, its flavors lingering in the pot like old whispers. There were no spices to mask it, no vinegar to brighten it. Just a slow, familiar dullness, a taste like something boiled straight out of history. Bread was the other staple. Not soft, not golden, not inviting. It was dense, dark and heavy, often made from rye, barley or oats. Wheat, the soft, white variety, was a luxury reserved for the upper class. Most peasants never touched it, let alone baked with it. Their loaves were squat, barely risen, and quick to crumble. Leave one out overnight, and it was hard enough to double as a weapon. Still, it filled the belly and gave you something to soak in your stew. In leaner times, bread could be made from ground peas, chaff, or whatever remained at the bottom of the miller's barrel. In desperation, people turned to tree bark, not metaphorically, but literally. The inner bark was ground and mixed with meager flour to create famine bread, bitter, coarse, barely digestible, but enough to survive another day. When even flour ran low, old slices of bread, known as trenchers, served as plates. They soaked up the meal and were either eaten after or tossed to the animals. Sometimes they were passed down the table to someone of lesser status. Bread even had its own hierarchy. Meat was rare, more hope than habit. Chickens were kept for eggs, cows for milk. Livestock were only slaughtered out of necessity, and when they were, nothing was wasted. Meat, fat, organs, bones, all used. Blood became pudding, fat was rendered, the head might be turned into soup. Pork was the most common when available. Pigs were efficient, and their salted fat could make bland food taste faintly of comfort. But slaughtering a pig was a major event, planned in advance, with salting, curing, and storing taking days. Fishing helped if you lived near water, but most rivers and lakes were owned by lords. Fishing without permission could get you fined, or worse. When you did fish, it was for eels, small river catch, or anything that wouldn't spoil immediately. Salted herring was considered a treasure. The church played a role in your diet too. On Fridays and during Lent, meat was forbidden, pushing people toward fish or simple fasting. In times of need, even beaver tails were classified as fish. An ecclesiastical loophole, few questioned if it meant a meal. Milk was more common, but perishable. It had to be consumed quickly or made into butter or cheese. Butter was a treat, used carefully. Cheese was sharp, dry, and a sign of a good season. Dairy, while valuable, didn't always agree with people, and without refrigeration, spoilage was a constant risk. Sour milk was used anyway. Rancid butter, moldy cheese, you just cut around the rot and hoped your gut was strong. Drinks were basic. Water wasn't always safe, depending on the season and your neighbors upstream, so people drank ale. Weak ale, small beer, was brewed at home and drunk by all, even children. It had just enough alcohol to kill bacteria and make the day a little easier. If apples or pears were around, you might make cider. Wine was for nobles and priests. Mead was rare. Milk was for the sick or very young. For everyone else, it was ale with every meal from dawn till dark. Vegetables were the backbone of your diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, leeks, turnips. Carrots, though not orange. The medieval kinds were white or purple. Most vegetables were grown in small home gardens, carefully tended and consumed entirely. Tops were boiled, skins were burned or composted. Nothing went to waste. Fruits were seasonal, apples were most common. Berries and wild plums came and went quickly. Drying helped them last, but preserving was difficult. Sugar was far too expensive. Honey was precious if you had bees. Otherwise, the stew stayed savory in the loosest sense of the word. Herbs were grown when possible: parsley, sage, dill, mint. Their main role wasn't flavor, but function. Some were believed to ward off sickness or pests. Occasionally, they improved the taste by accident, not design. Meals were communal, shared on benches around the fire. No courses, no recipes. Just a pot, a hunk of bread, and the quiet hope that something would remain for tomorrow. Complaining didn't thicken the stew. If there was a feast, a wedding, a harvest, a saint's day, you might get a roast bird or a pie. Not the buttery kind, but a thick-walled crust to contain meat. Heavily spiced, if spices could be found, maybe pepper, ginger, or cinnamon. But that was rare. When someone managed to trade well, feast days were still rare. Most days passed quietly. You scraped the last bits from your bowl, soaked your bread in the stew, sipped your ale, and leaned back, full enough to get through the evening, but hardly satisfied. There was a certain comfort in the routine, knowing exactly how the pot would taste, how much bread remained, watching the same hands prepare the same meal beside the same fire. As the wind whispered through cracks in the walls and animals shifted in their sleep, the stew simmered, the bread cooled, and once again, you had just enough. As a medieval peasant, you owned very little, maybe a small patch of land, a few tools, a couple of animals, and a crooked house built with your own hands. But none of it was truly yours. It belonged to the Lord, not some distant king or mythical figure, but your local landholder, the man who lived uphill in a slightly less crooked house with better food and a roof that probably didn't leak. He owned the land, and with it, everything on it, including, in a way, you. You were classified as a villain, not an insult, but a legal status. You worked the land, but did not own it. You were bound to it, unable to leave without permission or freely pass it on. You owed labor, goods, and respect. You weren't a slave, but you weren't free either. Your relationship with the Lord wasn't one of friendship or conversation, but of obligation. You dealt with the steward, the man who managed the estate and kept track of what everyone owed, and you owed a great deal. There was labor to provide, several days each week, sometimes more during harvest, spent working the Lord's fields instead of your own. This was called corvée labor, unpaid and unthanked. Somewhere in the manor house, someone ate thanks to your work, but you saw none of it directly. Taxes came in many forms: a share of your grain, a portion of your wool, a chicken here, some eggs there. If you brewed ale, you owed ale. Owned a pig? Then bacon was due, caught fish. The river belonged to the Lord, so your catch wasn't really yours. The fees extended beyond food. Using the mill meant paying a charge, even though it was the only way to grind grain. Grinding by hand was often illegal, punishable by fines or worse. The Lord wanted more than just his share. He wanted control. The oven was the same. Many manors had a communal oven you paid to use. Baking at home, if discovered, could bring consequences. You learned to follow the official ways, even if they cost more time and money and made little sense. Then there were the fees. Wanting to marry, inherit your father's land, or move to another village all came with a price. Permission was required, and fees had to be paid. Livestock and tools were taxed. Breeding was tightly controlled. Barely anything escaped the Lord's claim. In theory, the Lord was supposed to protect you. His men-at-arms defended against bandits or rival nobles. In famine, he might dole out grain, though rarely for free. The Lord's court settled disputes, like if a neighbor's goat wandered into your garden, but again, for a price. This was feudalism, a system wrapped in words of loyalty and protection, but in practice, it was ownership. The land meant everything. Those who owned it ruled, those who worked it obeyed. The manor stood apart from the village, often on higher ground, built of stone or timber, larger than any peasant's home, with thick, thatched roofs that kept the wind out. Inside were tapestries, servants, tables, and the Lord himself, dressed in wool, lined with fur, eating meals beyond your imagination, rarely thinking of you. He might not know your name, but he knew your numbers. How much barley you owed, how many eggs you promised, whether your son was old enough for labor. All was recorded, not by you, since you couldn't read, but by the steward, the reeve, or the bailiff, who carried wax tablets or parchment and asked questions you learned to answer carefully. If you failed to meet your obligations, punishments followed: fines, extra labor, confiscation of tools or land, even loss of your home or animals. Resistance was not rebellion, but foolishness. Yet strangely the system endured, not because it was just, but because it was stable. Harsh but predictable, you knew what was owed and what was expected. No surprises, just the steady rhythm of giving, giving, giving. Occasionally, the Lord gave back. A feast day, a holiday free of work, a kind word from horseback. Not enough to balance the scales, but enough to prevent collapse. The relationship was never friendly but enduring. Your Lord might be young or old, kind or cruel, near or distant, but always above. You bowed as he passed, removed your cap, used the right words, not because he deserved them, but to avoid trouble. And perhaps deep down, a small part of you hoped for recognition, reward, elevation, though it almost never came. That hope kept the system alive, not just fear, but a faint promise that if you worked hard enough, obeyed long enough, prayed loud enough, something might change. Meanwhile, the steward walked, the reeve recorded, the mill ground grain, and you dug your hands into the soil year after year, season after season. There was no retirement, no bonus, no rise in status, only the quiet knowledge that you had fulfilled your role. You survived another year under the weight of someone else's title. As long as the Lord was pleased, you were allowed to keep living. Long before the Black Death ravaged Europe and carved its place in history, medieval peasants were no strangers to sickness, not just the seasonal illnesses, though there were plenty, but a constant shadow of something waiting to go wrong. Infection, fever, wasting, swelling, coughing. Disease wasn't a rare event, it was part of life. You didn't need a continent-wide catastrophe to be struck down. A small cut, a flea, a glass of water that seemed clear but wasn't. All could bring illness. Unlike taxes or weather, disease didn't follow rules. It came without warning and rarely left quietly. Hospitals, as we know them, didn't exist. If you were lucky, your village had a wise woman or midwife who knew which herbs to boil or burn. If extremely lucky, a literate monk might be nearby, well-meaning and slightly more effective than random prayer. Mostly, though, when you fell ill, you stayed home, sweating through your clothes and hoping. No one understood germs yet. Microscopes were centuries away. Instead, people had old, confusing, often wrong ideas. Some blamed bad air, believing that foul smells carried disease. If the village smelled of rot manure or smoke, it was considered dangerous, which was partly true, though for reasons misunderstood. To combat bad air, people stuffed herbs into their clothes, carried flowers, or pressed vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces, not helpful, but deeply believed. Others thought illness was divine punishment, an outcome of sin, impure thoughts, disobedience, or moral decay. If your child fell sick, it was seen as a trial. If your crops failed and then your own health faltered, the blame likely fell on you, your neighbors, or both. Local beliefs shaped many explanations. Some thought illness was caused by the evil eye, a jealous or angry glare. Others pointed to the phases of the moon, restless animal spirits, or disgruntled saints. A particularly common idea was that sickness entered the body through the soles of the feet. The remedy? Boil them. And if that didn't work, burn something nearby, sometimes even your mattress. The cures were as strange as the causes. If you had a fever, someone might come to bleed you, a man armed with a blade, a bowl, and more confidence than actual medical knowledge. Leeches might be applied, sharp stones too. The goal was to restore balance among your humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Though invisible, these humours were blamed for nearly every ailment. For swelling, people applied poultices, mashes of herbs, mud, or even bread wrapped in cloth and tied to the sore spot. Some remedies helped, most didn't, and a few only made things worse. But the key was that something was done. If your stomach ached, you might chew charcoal. If you coughed up blood, wine mixed with crushed pearls was a remedy. Blurred vision might bring whispered prayers and smoke blown over your head. But if your leg turned black, hope was nearly gone. People also carried plague amulets, small pieces of metal or bone inscribed with protective words or blessed by priests. Some buried onions in the corners of their homes, others hung garlic above the doorways. A curious remedy was to tie a live chicken to the infected limb, hoping the sickness would transfer to the bird. It rarely worked, but hope was scarce, and people clung to whatever might help. Sickness was isolating, but not like the quarantine we think of today. You didn't call for help. You just kept working until you couldn't anymore. When you finally lay down, life continued around you. Children and animals were fed. You might get broth and soft prayers murmured nearby. Sometimes illness passed. The fever broke, swelling faded. You got up again, slow and limping, with a new appreciation for warm soup. Other times it didn't, and your family lit candles for you. The plague wasn't always the terrifying sudden disease that left bodies in carts. Often it was a slow, creeping infection, skin darkening, limbs swelling, rattling coughs, smallpox, leprosy, dysentery. Even the flu could sweep through a village, leaving half the people bedridden. There were no statistics, no reports, only stories. A traveller might say the cough started in the next village last week. Or someone would hear that 3 children had died near the river. People paid attention. They boiled water more often, left herbs by the door, kept their distance, even if no one explained why. Death wasn't always feared outright, but it was understood. People recognized when it was near, the slowing breath, cooling skin, dull eyes. Soft prayers were whispered by firelight for those passing away. When the Black Death finally struck in the 14th century, its violence overwhelmed everything before it. Yet by then, people were already familiar with illness. The idea that you could be well in the morning and gone by night wasn't new. It was just happening more frequently. The plague came in waves, each one stronger than the last, bringing strange buboes swelling in the neck and groin, fevers that clouded the mind, and dark, bubbling blood. Death came in days, sometimes hours. Whole villages disappeared, fields were left untilled, and church bells tolled too often. Some peasants tried to run, but disease spread faster than any feet. Others turned to religion, praying harder, whipping themselves, promising to reform if spared. Some lashed out in anger, blaming outsiders, sinners, anyone but the wind that carried the sickness. The church offered explanations, comfort, and burial rites, but monks died by the thousands, priests vanished, and the world was changed forever. In many places, death became so routine that funerals were often skipped altogether. Bodies were laid to rest in mass graves, usually without names or markers. Still, life went on. People adapted to living alongside sickness. They accepted it much like hunger or cold, not with joy, but with a weary kind of endurance. Homes were cleaned more regularly. Herbs were shared among neighbors. New prayers were quietly whispered. Some believed that surviving one illness granted protection against the next. Others doubted such things, yet still rose each day to milk the cow and carry on. Children grew up knowing which plants were harmful, which ones could be chewed for relief, and which needed boiling until their foul smell disappeared. They learned how to dress wounds, how to wait through fevers, and how to recognize when someone was beyond saving, and when to let go of hope. Despite it all, life didn't stop. People married, harvested what they could, and shared meager meals. They gathered by firesides to retell stories about the last sickness that passed through, or how someone's grandfather survived a harsh winter fever on nothing but garlic water and sheer stubbornness. The plague wasn't the end of everything, it was just part of life's harsh reality. For those who survived, endurance became a form of quiet resistance, a stubborn refusal to fade away without a fight, a hope that tomorrow would come, and if it didn't, someone else would remember your name, or at least recall how you always added rosemary to the broth. Nightfall in the medieval countryside wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy silence, like inside a cave, filled with distant creaks and subtle sounds, the kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of your own breathing and heartbeat. The day ended when the light disappeared, and anything left out had to be quickly put away, because once darkness took hold, the world shrank to the space around you. There was no artificial light, no candles burning freely through the night. Wax was too precious. If a tallow lamp was available, it was saved for emergencies or religious rituals. Most nights, the fire dwindled to glowing embers, and that was all. And so people slept, but not the way we imagine sleep today. It was never a long, uninterrupted rest. In the Middle Ages, sleep came in two distinct phases. First came the initial sleep, followed by a waking period, and then a second sleep. This pattern wasn't accidental, it was how people adapted to the long, dark hours between dusk and dawn. Soon after night fell, you would drift into your first sleep. The fire was banked low, the animals quieted down, children hushed. The home, usually just 1 or 2 rooms, would settle into stillness. If you were lucky, your mattress was stuffed with straw or feathers, though it was often lumpy and shared. Without one, you slept on woven rushes or right on the earth itself, softened only by familiarity. Everyone slept together, family, relatives, even servants, all crowded into the same space. Not out of affection, but necessity. It was the only warm room in the house. On the coldest nights, even animals were brought indoors, a goat by the door, a dog curled near the hearth, chickens tucked in a basket. Warmth mattered more than boundaries. There was no privacy. Sleeping alone was linked to punishment, not comfort. The wealthy might afford solitude, everyone else simply made do. You faced the wall, stuffed straw in your ears, shared blankets, and breathed in each other's presence. And if someone snored, and someone always did, you learned to live with it. The first sleep lasted a few hours. Then, almost like clockwork, people would awaken. This wasn't disturbing, it was expected. Around midnight, the world was quiet and still. Some prayed, Others stirred the dying coals. A few used the chamber pot or stepped outside into the cold night air. Some reflected silently, others whispered softly. This time was also rich with vivid dreams. Many believed this midnight hour opened a thin veil between the living and the dead, the sacred and the everyday. Dreams during this waking period were remembered clearly and talked about the next day as meaningful messages, not mere passing thoughts. Eventually, the second sleep came, deeper and slower. This was the restorative sleep when aches eased and the day's wear softened. If you were fortunate, this sleep was uninterrupted. If not, you lay still, waiting for dawn to give you a reason to rise. The night never fell completely silent. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the thatch, a baby might fuss, a cow shuffled its hooves. Sometimes the stillness was broken by a persistent rattling cough, noticed by all yet spoken of by none. Fear of the dark was real, grounded in both imagined and actual dangers. Wolves, for example, were not just legends. Their howls sometimes echoed near the village, sending chills down spines. They were real and hungry. There were also thieves, strangers lurking, fires sparked by careless embers, roofs groaning under heavy snow, and then less tangible threats, ghosts, spirits, demons, witches. People rarely spoke openly of these, but everyone knew they existed. To guard their homes, people followed rituals, placing iron by the door, tracing the sign of the cross above the hearth, whispering blessings over straw mattresses, hanging protective herbs like rosemary, sage, and rue above entrances. Sometimes a string was tied around a child's wrist, just in case. Even with these measures, some believed sleep left you vulnerable, that the soul wandered while the body rested. So they took care, covering mirrors, facing the bed toward the fire, avoiding sleeping with feet pointed at the door. The cold was an enemy all its own. It crept through walls, seeped through thatch, and slipped past poorly sealed doors. People didn't bury themselves under piles of blankets. Instead, they layered wool, fur, cloaks, and tunics. The very thought of undressing for bed seemed absurd. You slept fully clothed, sometimes even with your boots on. Sleeping close to others brought both comfort and discomfort. There was always someone shifting in their sleep, a murmured word, the occasional nudge from the family dog. Silence wasn't expected. What mattered was closeness. Within that closeness, there was a strange kind of safety. You heard your father's steady breathing, your child's restless twitch, your grandmother softly murmuring prayers in her sleep. It wasn't peaceful, but it was real, human, and shared. Dreams held meaning. A field of waving wheat could promise prosperity. A snake might signal illness. A broken tooth could foretell death. People learned to interpret these signs, or found someone in the village who could. There were unofficial dream readers trusted by all. The church, however, warned that some dreams came from the devil, that nighttime was when temptation could creep in. You were urged to pray before sleep, to guard your thoughts and keep your soul ready, because the night could be your last. Many went to sleep and never woke. Illness took hold quietly while you rested. Fevers rose, coughs worsened. By morning, someone might be gone, slipping away as if stolen. This uncertainty gave every dawn a reverent weight. When light returned, the rooster crowed, and coals were stirred back to life. It meant you had survived once more. You rose slowly. Every joint reminded you of your age, no matter how young you were. The cold bit your nose. You wiped your face, looked around, and counted the living. Everyone who stirred was accounted for. Those who didn't were checked on. Only after this was the day allowed to begin. Water was drawn, bread prepared, animals fed. If your dream had meaning, it was shared. The memory of the night faded, not forgotten, but softened, folded into the unfolding hours. In winter, sleep came early and lingered long. In summer, it shortened, but the pattern remained: first sleep, waking hour, second sleep, a world without clocks, yet not without routine. For all its hardships, there was something steady in that rhythm, something honest. Comfort wasn't the goal, endurance was. And if along the way you found a moment of rest, a warm night, a rare quiet, a dream that didn't bring fear, that was a gift. One you didn't question, one you never expected too soon. Some years you were simply hungry. Other years, famine struck. Hunger had rules. You stretched your food, rationed carefully, held on to hope. Famine broke every rule. It came when fields failed, the root sellers' baskets were bare, and there was no longer any pretending that next week would be better. Famine is when food becomes more an idea than a reality. In a medieval village, you could often see it coming long before it struck. It began in spring. Too much rain or too little. Barley sprouted in patches, beans blossomed, then withered. Cabbages split open too soon. Wheat heads stayed small, drooping as if mourning a loss yet to come. Everyone noticed. At first, no one spoke aloud, but the looks passed between neighbors. Quiet calculations formed in each mind. How much grain is left from last year? How many seeds can we save? How much can we afford to eat now? The answers were never hopeful. The hardest choice came in summer, not winter, when you had to decide, plant seeds for a future harvest that might never arrive, or grind them into flour to feed your child today. Slowly, portions shrank. Stew grew thin, bread loaves became smaller, bowls stopped coming back empty. Instead, they simply came back less often. Panic hadn't set in yet. You told yourself this had happened before. Maybe another village had surplus. Perhaps the manor's stores could help. Hope lingered, fragile but alive. By August, denial grew difficult. By September, impossible. You stopped feeding the animals first. Chickens fell silent. Goats grew thin and hollow-eyed. The dog, if you were lucky enough to have one, stopped barking and trailed close by, as if knowing it might be next. Bread became sacred. One loaf was split 5 ways. Everyone ate slower, and no one complained about the crust. Even the tiniest crumb was swept up with care. Stew was mostly water now. Any color came from the pot itself. You boiled weeds, ground roots, and pulled up strange plants, hoping they weren't poisonous. Some weren't. Nights were sleepless, not because of fear, but because hunger gnawed at your stomach every few hours. Children stopped asking questions. That was when you knew the truth had settled in. They didn't ask when the bread would come, nor did they beg for honey or stories. Instead, they sat quietly by the fire, learning how to wait. Neighbors disappeared from the streets. The village fell silent. No more laughter in the lanes, no more quarrels over sheep. Only the occasional cough or the snap of firewood broke the stillness. Famine didn't make people cruel, it made them quiet. Sometimes someone would return with a rabbit, a bird, or a handful of acorns to soak and grind. You ate them, bitter as they were, and smiled, not because they tasted good, but because they were something. You tried not to resent the giver. Sometimes grain was shared, sometimes not. The steward visited less often, which was both good and bad. Good, because he wasn't there to take anything. Bad, because he wasn't there to help either. His silence spoke volumes. The church did what it could, offering bread after Mass, alms for the poorest, but even they were stretched thin. You prayed more, not from faith, but from habit. Words were easier to say than the work your tired hands could no longer do. Some left the village altogether, packing what little they had, to seek food, work, or God. Some came back. Some never did. No one asked where or why. There was no energy left for questions. The body changes during famine. First, you feel your ribs, not from the outside, but from within, as if they press too close beneath your skin. You stand more slowly. Bruises appear with ease. You wake with your hands clenched tight, as if still holding tools you can no longer afford to use. The cold bites deeper. The fire becomes your closest companion. You spend more time tending its flames than cooking over it. You sit near it, sleep facing it. You feed the fire even when your own stomach is empty, because warmth is the one luxury still within your reach. By now you've eaten everything edible, the roots, the weeds, dried beans, stale flour. You've boiled bones again and again, soaked bark, baked famine bread that cracks your teeth. When even that ran out, you turned to things not meant for eating, but that might sustain you if prepared just right. Leeks, boiled and salted, not tasty or filling, but chewable enough. Once, you found a rat. You didn't scream. You thanked God silently. You hid it, cooked it alone, and told no one. Guilt lingers, but regret does not. Dreams turn strange. You dream of feasts with tables piled high with roast, bread, and wine. You wake biting your tongue. You dream of boiling food you haven't touched in days. You dream of animals returning, green shoots pushing through snow. You dream of childhood when hunger felt simpler. Sometimes you even dream of fullness and wake crying. The graveyard grew slowly at first, then faster, then too fast to keep pace. You knew someone had died when the church bell stayed silent. It meant there weren't enough hands left to ring it. Graves were shallow, prayers brief, mourning quiet. Everyone had their own hunger to face. You wanted to grieve, but couldn't afford the weight of sorrow. You held it in like everything else. Then, like every famine, it ended, not suddenly but gradually. The rains came and stayed, the earth softened, seeds sprouted, plants reached upward, weak but alive. You found energy to hope again. You saved the first harvest for others, children first, elders next. You took the smallest portion and smiled as you passed the bowl. When the first good loaf emerged from the oven, cracked on top, dark below, you stared at it before eating. You remembered every empty day, every trick you used, every lie told to shield someone else. This time you ate slowly, and the food filled you. By the time you could walk again, the church had already claimed you. It had taken your name at baptism, blessed your breath with Latin you'd never understand, and stitched your soul into a system that reached far beyond the village. You belonged to the church, not by choice, but because there was no other. In the quiet moments, the dim mornings before the fire caught, the wet nights when the wind rattled the shutters, you felt the church's presence like gravity. It didn't simply exist alongside your life. It shaped it, judged it, taxed it, forgave it, and defined what came next. The church wasn't just a place you visited. It was the air you breathed, the road beneath your feet, the rhythm of your year. It was the voice that murmured over your grave and whispered about it long before you arrived. The village priest, often the only one who could read, was more than your confessor. He was your calendar, counselor, and closest thing to an oracle. He held secrets of the heavens, stories of saints, and reasons why pigs died or storms struck. He walked the village carrying blessings and threats in his robes. You brought your sins to him in hushed whispers, hoping he wouldn't show disappointment. You tried not to think about what he already knew. You saw him at birth, marriage, and death, the only guaranteed ceremonies in a peasant's life. And in between, he spoke for a God you feared more than you loved, because love, you were told, demanded obedience. Latin was the language of the Mass, sounding almost like a spell. You stood in the church beside your family, feet numb from the cold, hearing words that felt foreign, words that never belonged to you. You didn't understand what the priest said as he lifted the bread, but you believed, or at least tried to, that something unseen happened, that the bread was no longer bread, that the wine was no longer wine, that the murmured prayers and gestures could summon the divine. You didn't speak the words yourself, but they passed through you all the same. You mouthed along where you could. You crossed yourself when others did. You learned the rhythm of holiness like someone learning the way to a well, not knowing every step, but knowing it was something you needed. The church told you when to fast and when to feast. It divided the year into sacred moments: Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. You didn't say March or April, you said after Easter or near St. Michael's. It dictated what you could eat, when, and how much guilt you should carry while enjoying it. 40 days without meat before Easter, followed by a feast so rich it made you dizzy. Fish on Fridays, even if you lived far from water. Almond milk for the wealthy, turnips and cold broth for everyone else. On saint days, you shared what you had. On fasting days, you imagined what you didn't. Even when your bowl was empty, your plate was full of rules. Your calendar wasn't just for prayer, it was for payment. The church demanded 1/10 of your yield no matter the season: grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. If it came from your land or your labor, it had a price. You gave because it was God's portion, that's what they told you. But God didn't collect it. The priest did, or the steward, with his ledgers and silent nods. You watched your best barley hauled off to the tithe barn, always larger than your home. You saw your neighbors hand over their last sack of oats while the priest prayed for mercy they had just paid for. When the harvest failed, when rains were late or frost came too soon, the demand never changed. You owed what you owed. Sometimes they let you pay with candles or work. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the debt grew so heavy it bent your back, even when you stood tall. But the church didn't only take, it also gave, though not always, what you wanted. It gave stories. It gave order. It gave meaning. When your cow died with no clear cause, the priest told you which saint to pray to. When your child fell ill, he said it might be a test, a punishment, or the devil slipping through a crack in your faith. He offered blessings and sacraments, told you to light a candle or visit a shrine. Sometimes he gave you a relic, a bone, a tooth, a ribbon soaked in some forgotten martyr's blood. You held it like treasure. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But even when it didn't, it was better than nothing. There were saints for everything: Saint Apollonia for teeth, Saint Isidore for ploughing, Saint Sebastian for plague. You didn't know where they were buried or when they lived. You only knew their names and what they could fix. Their stories were half memory, half magic, told by firelight, by people unsure where truth ended and legend began. You called on them when you had nothing else. You whispered their names while stirring the pot or kneeling in the field. You made bargains with them, promising bread, fasting, or a pilgrimage if only they would help you this once. Sometimes they did, or seemed to, and that was enough to ask again. Pilgrimage was a holy journey and a way to escape. For a few days, you left the same 5 miles you'd known all your life. You walked unfamiliar roads toward shrines you'd only heard about. You carried your prayers on your back, clutched them in your hands. You slept under hedges or in barn corners. You arrived footsore and aching, stood before a bone or statue, hoping something inside you would change. Sometimes it did. You returned not healed, but changed, or at least tired enough to believe you had been. Even death was a ritual choreographed by the church. When it neared, you sent for the priest. He came with oil and words, touched your forehead, prayed over your body, tried to ease your soul into what came next. Your family gathered, candles were lit, the bell rang if anyone was strong enough. You were buried on sacred ground alongside those who had walked the same path. Then came the masses. Your family lit more candles, paid for prayers, hoping the priest remembered your name in his chants, because even in death there were debts. The church taught that your soul might not go straight to heaven. It might linger in purgatory, a shadowed hall between suffering and salvation. You could wait there years, centuries, or longer unless someone helped, unless someone prayed, paid, lit enough candles, said your name often enough to pull you through. So your family gave what they could, the poor with bread, the rich with land, all to shorten a stay in a place no one had seen but everyone feared. Fear, too, was part of the church's gift. The church explained the world when no one else could. It told you why the rains failed, why your child didn't wake, why illness took the young but spared the cruel. It taught that suffering had meaning, that obedience brought reward. It gave you order amid chaos, and that order, even when heavy, gave you peace. Not comfort, always, but peace. You never seriously questioned the church's authority, at least not aloud. Maybe you grumbled about the tithe or muttered curses when the priest looked the other way, but you kept coming back. You didn't stop kneeling. You didn't stop crossing yourself when the bell tolled, because if the church was wrong, then the world lost all meaning. And a world without meaning was a terrifying place. Even when the priest overindulged in wine, even when the bishop demanded more taxes than seemed fair, even when the indulgent seller rolled through town with a cart full of empty promises and a purse full of coins, you still believed, or at least acted as if you did. In the end, belief was less about what you thought and more about what you did. You might not have understood Latin, but you grasped the order of things. You stayed within it because it was the only way forward. And when you died, you hoped the bells would ring, the candles would burn, and your name would be spoken enough to be remembered. You hoped the saints still heard your prayers. You hoped your sins had been balanced by forgiveness. You hoped the church, with all its weight, mystery, dust, and gold, would carry you onward. You might think that after all they suffered, famines, plagues, endless taxes, and the harsh rule of their lords, peasants would have risen up more often, that centuries of hardship would have cracked the walls of their villages, and one cold morning something inside them would snap. You might imagine them gathering in fields and marketplaces, tools raised and fire in their hearts, shouting that they would kneel no longer. But they didn't. Not often, not for long, and never all together. Yes, there were revolts, the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, the Jacquerie in France decades earlier, small flare-ups scattered like stones tossed into still water, angry voices rising where lords had taken too much, pushed too far, taxed one coin too many. Sometimes sparks caught, houses burned, stewards chased away, banners lifted. But those fires burned out quickly, snuffed by gallows built in village squares, followed by silence heavier than before. The world didn't change, the grain still needed sowing. To understand why peasants didn't revolt more often, you have to stop seeing them as naive or cowardly. They weren't. They were survivors, not of single disasters, but of endless hardship stretched year after year. They lived under low ceilings where hope was rationed like grain. They weren't lacking in courage, they lacked room to risk. Every day was spent patching roofs and keeping soup warm. There was no time or energy left to plan a rebellion. You could organize an uprising, or you could dig potatoes. You couldn't do both. The system worked not because it was kind or efficient, but because it was ancient. Its roots had sunk deep into generations' habits. It didn't need justification. It simply existed. You owed labor, you owed grain, you owed the church its tenth, and the Lord his harvest. You owed a quiet nod when the reeve passed your door. You were born into that debt, and unless luck favored you, you died in it too. But by staying inside those bounds, you could survive. Barely, yes, but survive. The cost of stepping outside was too high. The manor had soldiers, the church had excommunication. The king barely knew you existed, but his laws bound you like chains. Punishment for defiance wasn't always death. Sometimes it was worse: banishment, starvation, your family left to pay the debts you tried to escape. Everyone had heard stories: fathers taken, mothers whipped, cousins vanished after refusing to pay. Those stories weren't told to spark rebellion, they were warnings meant to prevent it. Besides, rebellion often didn't feel like an option because the people you lived among were not strangers. They were your kin, your neighbors. You shared fields, tools, fences, prayers. Even if you hated the steward, you might still marry his daughter. Even if you resented the tithe, you brought bread to mass. The village wasn't a place you could leave easily, nor one you could tear apart without tearing yourself apart. To revolt against the manor was, in a small way, to revolt against the rhythms of your own life. It's easy, centuries later, to picture peasants as figures of eternal submission, heads bowed, hats in hand, but that view misses their complexity. Submission was not simple servitude, it was negotiation. Most peasants didn't just endure, they adapted, they bargained, They bent. They found cracks in the walls and made homes in the spaces between the rules. A pig kept off the ledger, an extra sack of rye hidden in the earth, a bribe paid in eggs rather than coin. These were the rebellions they could afford. Practical people, living in a world ruled not by ideology but by weather. The question was not what was just, but what would feed them through winter. Justice, if it ever came, was a luxury they didn't trust. Lords changed, priests were replaced, rules shifted, but the wind still blew, the soil still needed turning, and children still cried from hunger. You didn't revolt against that, you endured it. The church played its part too, perhaps more effectively than the sword. It taught that suffering was holy, that endurance was righteous, that the meek would inherit the earth, though it never said when. You were told your trials were purification, not punishment, and that obedience would be rewarded in the next life. If the promise of heaven wasn't enough, the threat of hell filled in the rest: fire, torment, gnashing teeth, waiting for the proud, the rebellious, the ones who said no. Yet peasants were not passive. Their resistance was quieter. They gossiped about stewards, sang rude songs about lords, laughed when priests stumbled over sermons. They told stories at night of better days and better men. They found dignity in small acts, a shared crust, a well-timed silence, a field tended just a little differently than the rulebook said. Their rebellion was the way they survived, despite everything, not because they accepted the system, but because they bent it enough to breathe. Sometimes things changed. A lord died and his son was kinder. A new bishop forgave debts. A terrible storm reminded the powerful of their mortality. But these changes came from above. The peasants' job was to wait, to endure, to hand down what little they had, and to teach their children to be quiet when they must, and brave when they could. And there were dreams, of course, maybe not called revolution, but thoughts of a different life, a day when your child wouldn't carry the same burdens, when no one knocked on your door with a list, when your back didn't ache before you turned 30, when you could sleep without fearing wolves or soldiers or winter. Those dreams kept you alive, but they lived alongside reality. You didn't expect them to come true, you just needed them to survive. What's remarkable is not that peasants revolted so rarely, but that they preserved their culture, faith, and families under the crushing weight of the system. They kept songs alive that no one wrote down, passed stories from one generation to the next, remembered which plants healed and which didn't, taught each other how to pray, how to birth children, how to bury the dead. They created a continuity that outlasted kings and crusades, not through banners or battles, but through persistence. Persistence was their rebellion. When the manna demanded too much, they survived anyway. When the church taxed their sins, they still lit candles. When the world turned against them, they huddled close and waited for spring. The fields might have belonged to others, but the soil remembered their hands. Revolution didn't live in them as it would in later centuries, in the speeches of radicals or the chants of crowds. But there was a different kind of strength in how they endured, living a hard life without letting it harden them completely. To kneel, not because they were weak, but because they knew they could rise again tomorrow. That too was resistance. So they endured quietly, without monuments or songs in their names. They endured in the rhythm of the plough, the smoke rising from cottages at dusk, the lullabies sung beside dying fires. They endured in whispered stories told to children who would grow up and tell them again. History often forgets them or shrinks them to footnotes beneath kings and conquests, but peasants were the thread holding the tapestry together. Without them, no harvests, no cathedrals, no armies marching under banners. They built the world even as they were kept from owning it. They may not have overthrown their lords, but they outlasted them. And perhaps that was revolution enough.